All right. Well, this is another one of these little interludes where I try to take some point of view that I think is may at first cut seem like it has nothing to do with science, but to circle it back to the whys and wherefores of this course. So, the second edition of our book, Physical Biology of the Cell, was in many ways, at least philosophically and almost sometimes like scientifically driven by a particular story of Borges, which I will get to in a few moments. So this is a Jorge Luis Borges, who was an Argentinian author, very much in the South American tradition, extremely imaginative, and had a certain mathematical bent. He had a quite a sympathy for the things like Zeno's paradox and the mathematics of infinity and mirrors and series and things like that in a very weird and interesting way, I would say. And I wanted to bring him up for two reasons. The first of which is that I had this previous interlude on the literature, and I said that I was interested in making sure to give credit where credit is due, and I haven't changed my mind about that at all. But there was a second part to what I wanted to say about the literature, which I forgot to mention at the time, and that I'm going to use Borges as a means to represent. And that has to do with it's in a way a plug, it's a little exaggerated, but a plug for not reading the literature, for being on that desert island with Wilson, for trying to figure things out for ourselves, for confronting a phenomenon, maybe learning a little bit, but then sitting there by oneself. And my reason is that I think that there's a certain richness that comes through figuring it out for yourself as opposed to being sort of spoon-fed something on the part of somebody else. So I'm gonna use a story of Borges to illustrate this, and the story that I have in mind is called Pierre Maynard, author of the Quixote. It tells of a guy whose name is Pierre Maynard, and he was a writer. Let's call him I don't know if I should say second rate, but not a well-known author. And this is in a way his autobiography. And in it, the narrator tells us that Maynard had left behind, as you can see, I have said that Maynard's visible work can be easily enumerated. Having examined with care his personal files, I find that they contain the following items. And he proceeds to give us on the order of it goes up through the letter S. So, on the order of 20 distinct writings from Maynard. And then at the bottom of this page, he sort of really warms up to his main theme. Two texts of unequal value inspired this undertaking. One is that philological fragment, blah, blah, blah. And then he says that, read at the bottom of that paragraph, those who have insinuated that Maynard dedicated his life to writing a contemporary Quixote calumniate his illustrious memory. He did not want to compose another Quixote, which is easy, but the Quixote itself. Needless to say, he never contemplated a mechanical transcription of the original. He did not propose to copy it. His admirable intention was to produce a few pages which would coincide word for word and line for line with those of Miguel de Cervantes. Now, what the heck does this have to do with thinking for oneself and trying to figure things out for oneself? It has to do, I had a vignette a little bit ago about autoactivation. And I could have said to you, yeah, here's the diagram. Go off and think about it. And if you came back and you had figured out a version of that and ended up coinciding word for word with what I did, I'm going to claim that yours would be much deeper than mine, because in some sense what I told you I learned from somebody else, and yours would have had the richness of self-invention. And we should never underrate, even if it's self-invention, it's known by others, it's still a feather in your cap, and it's still a perfection of your craft as a creator. So anyway, he says, my intent is no more astonishing, he wrote me the 30th of September 1934 from Bayonne. The final term in a theological or metaphysical demonstration, the objective world, God, causality, the forms of the universe, is no less previous and common than my famed novel. So he's saying at the bottom, I think this is very funny, the first method he conceived was relatively simple. Know Spanish well, recover the Catholic faith, fight against the Moors or the Turk, forget the history of Europe between the years 1602 and 1918, be Miguel de Cervantes. Pierre Maynard studied this procedure. I know he attained a fairly accurate command of 17th century Spanish, but discarded it as too easy, rather as impossible, my reader will say. Granted, but the undertaking was impossible from the very beginning, and of all the impossible ways of carrying it out, this was the least interesting. To be in the 20th century a popular novelist of the 17th seemed to him a diminution. To be in some way Cervantes and reach the Quixote seemed less arduous to him, and consequently less interesting, than go on being Pierre Maynard and reach the Quixote through the experiences of Pierre Maynard. So, that's the conceit of this thing, which is that he was gonna think this thing through, and he would end up, writing it for himself. And all I really wanted to do is I wanted to read you this. This is in a way the denouement of the whole little short story. And for me, it's the point. I always think of this when I'm thinking about figuring things out for ourselves. It is a revelation to compare Maynard's Don Quixote with Cervantes's. The latter, for example, wrote. So this is Cervantes. Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor. Written in the 17th century, written by the lay genius Cervantes, this enumeration is a mere rhetorical praise of history. Maynard, on the other hand, writes, Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor. History, the mother of truth. The idea is astounding. Maynard, contemporary of William James, does not define history as an inquiry into reality, but as its origin. Historical truth for him is not what has happened, it is what we judge to have happened. The final phrases, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor, are brazenly pragmatic. The contrast in style is also vivid. The archaic style of Maynard, quite foreign after all, suffers from a certain affectation, not so that of his forerunner, who handles with ease the current Spanish of his time. So again, this may seem a little bizarre, but let me just try to summarize. So let me tell you, it's been a while since you had 10th grade algebra and trigonometry. Go off and find a way to find two ways to derive the formula for sine of A plus B. Go off by yourself and invent it, and it will be yours. It will be your theorem, even though others have, prior to you, many others have figured it out. It's been a homework exercise with guidance. But my claim is that having your algebra teacher, your 10th grade teacher, teach you sine A plus B and what it's equal to is nowhere near the same experience as having figured it out for yourself, even though the formulae are identical in exactly the same way as this thing from Borges. The formulae are identical, but in one case it's preconceived, digested knowledge that's part of a curriculum that somebody else lays on you. And in the second case, it's you confronting a mathematical truth by yourself without looking anything up. And, I'm going to say the contrast in style is so vivid. So that's the first of my little Borges things. The second one has to do with abstraction. So now I'm no longer on the subject of the literature, but I'm more on the spirit of the course. So this is a short story by Borges. It's one paragraph, and I love to read it, and it's the basis of all the maps in the second edition of Physical Biology of the Cell. It has to do with no apologies for abstraction. So here's the story. It's called On Exactitude in Science. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that that vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of the map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. This is awesome. This is beautiful. And I'm giving you a modern incarnation of that very idea on the right, which shows two of my favorite places in the world, Biarritz and the Vercors, which is near Grenoble. And all that you need to know, the map is distorted. The treatment of Bretagne is messed up. But really all that you need to know is that if you want to take a train between those two cities, likely you're going to go back to Paris if you want to take a high-speed train. Paris is kind of the center point of the TGV system. And so, this map is an abstraction. It doesn't tell, similarly, if I look at a map of the London Tube, I'm not going to use it as a deciding factor in how far I'm going to walk when I get out of the tube. That's not its point. Its point is to tell you the connectivity of the various stops, and that's it. So it's an abstraction. And my point here is, do we really care that the map is distorted? And it doesn't try to be all things to all questions. It's trying to answer, a given map is trying to answer a particular thing. And so, what the point of this course is in some ways is that as biological theorists, we're map makers. And that is to say that we try to figure out how to represent a distorted landscape in some sort of a minimal way so that you can put the map in your pocket. We definitely don't want a map whose size is the size of the thing that it is representing. Otherwise, as we see here, that map is basically useless. So that was my little interlude on Borges and us. It's one of probably many interludes that I will give along the way. And if they're annoying, you can either ignore me or you can send me an angry email or whatever. But this is my attempt to tell you in some way that perhaps is also a little amusing about how to connect something interesting, such as this very brilliant South American author, and something very relevant to us, which is where are you going to get the formula for sine A plus B? And I'm just telling you, I think it will be much more useful if sine A plus B comes out of your own imagination. Similarly, the solution to the quadratic equation. If you were able to figure out how, by completing the squares on your own, how to get that formula, it would be so much richer than something you memorized in ninth grade.